I'm so delighted to be joined by three very interesting people. In fact, when I was asked to come and moderate this panel, and I thought, oh God, getting all the way from Santa Monica at that time, it was because of the guests that I said yes, because they are such interesting people. Let me start in the center, Seleta Reynolds, General Manager at the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, and she is still smiling.
Yes.
You have a very interesting job right now, as LA is in a kind of transitional moment with regards to transportation. Immediately to my left, Mike Milley, with Director of Foresight and Innovation at the LA studio, Designworks for BMW. Lovely to see you again, Mike. That's one of these secret studios where we don't typically get to see what's going on there. So we hope that you'll spill the beans. And over to my left, Riccardo Giraldi. He's Principal Creative Director with Microsoft Next Incubation. So I think it's fair to say that much of the conversation around autonomous cars has been around features, safety, technology, legality. What we're going to talk about here is design, making the ride more comfortable, usable for the driver. We'll hear about that momentarily, and how it integrates with the planning of the city. With our three guests, they're going to help us understand essentially the hardware aspects, the software aspects, and the environmental implications. So with that, I would like to throw it to hardware. Mike, tell us from your vantage point, from your place in thinking far ahead than most of us, what should we know about? What should we hear about with regards to where we're going with the self-driving car?
I think the most important thing that design does in the context of mobility is start with the human being, is to really think about the driver, the user, the passenger, and the pedestrian, and start with that really human lens. If we think too much about hardware as a sort of shiny, exciting, sexy object, we get distracted and pulled away from the meaningfulness that design can bring to the experience of mobility. So really starting with anticipating and understanding cultural, social, attitudinal, and behavioral changes help us to create solutions in the mobility space that are really going to be more meaningful than just sort of shiny, sexy, and plastic.
I'm just going to interject one sec and say there's something going on with my audio where I can't hear Mike very well. Can everybody else hear? You're good? If the audio person could perhaps fiddle with my audio so I can hear the guests, that would be great. But usability, comfort, are there some specifics?
I think it's a pretty broad palette. The change that we're thinking about at BMW right now is pretty big picture, right? That we're trying to think more about the systems and the context of mobility rather than just thinking about the person in the car with their two hands on the wheel, right? So how does the vehicle interact with the city? How does the vehicle support other things besides driving behavior? How does the vehicle situate itself in someone's whole life rather than just when they're literally on the street?
I think we should just back up and say the most recent news that most of us, regular folk read about an autonomous vehicle was the self-driving van that was tested in Las Vegas and instantly crashed with a human-driven car. I know the human was blamed, but nonetheless, the question that arose was, is this real? How far along is this? Where are we really at with the technology?
It's a real topic. I think there's a fantasy that people kind of express when we talk about autonomous vehicles where there's going to be a moment at some point in the nebulously 5 to 7 year future where suddenly every vehicle is a flying autonomous car, right? And the reality is that cars that are on the road today have autonomous kinds of features, right? That the car that I drove here in has the capacity to set a specific distance that I'm following the vehicle in front of it, to notify me of lane departure. Those are sort of autonomy adjacent, right? And so drivers are slowly getting kind of ramped into this step-by-step kind of appreciation and understanding of what it feels like to drive an autonomous vehicle. So we're not suddenly going to go from my 1985 Chrysler to a 2025 BMW that I can drive with a blindfold, right? There are going to be these slow steps that help us kind of adapt ourselves to the culture and experience of being a passenger/driver of an autonomous vehicle, right?
And Seleta, to you, that's got to be what you're thinking about. Helping the user of the street make that shift.
First of all, I'm totally stealing autonomous. That's awesome. Second, I love that Mike was like, let's not talk about shiny, sexy objects at the LA Auto Show.
Controversial.
But I think, super into it. But I think that's absolutely true, right? That when you think about the cities that you love, the places that you want to go back to over and over and over again, more often than not, what it comes down to is the quality of the public realm and all of the things that we love about cities that happen in that public realm. You see people watching, people are flirting, people are breaking up and making up and arguing, and that's really what makes a great city and a great place. And if autonomy helps get us there faster or helps unlock those kinds of opportunities, then it's absolutely something that we should be deeply invested in and be thinking about. What's the right path? Is the right path that we iterate towards autonomy because the human factors research is that people are not comfortable in a car yet where they don't have any control? It's really an issue of agency and control. Or do we want to go down the path of taking the steering wheel out of that car today, right now, and purpose building something that's different? These are the real questions. And again, they don't come down to the hardware or even the technology. They come down to what kind of a city do we want to live in and what kind of a place do we want to build for ourselves and our families.
You you paint such an interesting picture, and I'd love to hear you expand on how integrating autonomous cars into urban life might enhance our flirting or meeting people. How do you translate that image into a reality?
Well, I think Mike also touched on something else, which is that we need to explode our own version of what mobility is, what we think of when we think of public transit, and autonomy unlocks that, because really what it does is allow us to centrally manage a fleet of vehicles. And those vehicles can be taxi bots, or whatever we're going to call them, or they could be buses, or they could be shuttles. And if we can really focus on giving people a range of choices that gets them from A to B the most efficient, safest, most fun, most hospitable, most enjoyable way, then maybe we don't need to devote so much infrastructure to, for example, parking. 200 square miles in LA County devoted to the storage of dormant private vehicles. Think about what we could do with all of that space, what it might open up in terms of parks and schools and housing and plazas. So in LA, we have a program we call People Street. We also have a program we call Play Street, where we take the street and we transform it using temporary materials into public space, into a playground for a day, or into a plaza that people can come and gather and enjoy, their neighborhood with each other. In the future, if you're able to do that in a dynamic way, so maybe in the morning that street needs to move vehicles, but in the afternoon you can close it with the flip of a switch to the entire fleet of vehicles on the road and turn it into a park. And then in the evening it can be a place where people gather and watch movies and do all of the things that people love about their neighborhoods, because in LA, people definitely, they want traffic to work for them, but once they get to their neighborhoods, they just want to be Quakers. They don't want to go anywhere. They want to avoid traffic at all costs, and they want beautiful spaces. And so if technology can help us take those programs that are now sort of clunky and beta and 1.0 and make them easy and consistent and predictable and happening at scale, well, then we're interested.
How about situations that are unpredictable? Like, for example, when Uber and Lyft kicked off, when the ride-hailing car services kind of entered our world, we were promised that this would actually lead to less cars on the road because we could hail a car rather than, say, own one. Maybe we will get to that place, but right now, as I understand it from reports, we've got actually more cars on the road because people still own the cars, but they also, and the ride-hailing drivers are driving around and round and round. So to what extent can you control the future, I guess?
So I definitely cannot control the future. I do have a Harry Potter magic wand because I have 2 small children, but it doesn't actually do magic. So we have to work with more sort of clunkier tools to try and deal with what you're talking about, because the additional traffic doesn't just come from people circling what we call sort of zombie cars. It comes from people making additional trips that they wouldn't otherwise have done because it would be a pain to find a parking space, or all of a sudden they have what we call found time. So instead of having to drive the car, if you're sitting in the back seat and you can use that time to do other things, well, maybe you might choose to do a trip that otherwise you wouldn't have because you just didn't, you weren't able to get as much done. In New York City, the increase in traffic has been about a 7 to 10% increase in overall vehicle miles traveled. And we don't know exactly what that looks like in Los Angeles because Uber and Lyft don't share their data. So in the absence of data and in the absence of the ability to regulate, we need to focus on what we can control. And one of those things is curb space. So as the City Department of Transportation, I manage, regulate, and price access to the curb. And in California, we do that through a series of colors. If it's blue, it's accessible. If it's red, no parking, white, loading, yellow, etc. So think about a future where instead of all of those coded colors, there is a central database of the entire sort of curbside management of the city. And I can price access to the curb based on the efficiency of the trip. So are you carpooling with a friend? Well, then maybe it's a little cheaper for you to come pick up and drop off at the curb. Or are you by yourself in your fuel inefficient car? Maybe it's more expensive for you to pick up and drop off at the curb. So we have to sort of understand the creative constraints that we have as regulators and start to, number one, build real partnerships, but number two, focus on the things that we can regulate and control and start being more creative and thoughtful about how we can use those to get to the future we're after. Because you're right, if we allow the future to just sort of happen to us, what is more likely is that autonomy will increase congestion, will increase long trips, will increase travel. Uber and Lyft are totally gateway drugs to autonomous vehicles. And so there's no reason to think that what we see, those trends we see with Uber and Lyft now, and the other trend, by the way, is that they're mostly used by very well-educated, very wealthy city dwellers. Right? So there's equity in there as well. There's no reason to believe that autonomy will be any different unless we get in there with some real smart public policy.
I think
with smart. Oh, go on, Mark, and then I'll come to Riccardo.
I was just going to say, I think there's another really important tool in the toolkit here, outside of regulatory constraints and things like that, and that's design, right? And that's how can we create alternative sort of experiences that are really attractive and engaging and appealing and delightful, that we're not just penalizing people financially for engaging in behavior that's going to cause traffic problems, but we're creating solutions that are really wonderful.
Although, to Seleta's point, because in a way she's looking at ways to disincentivize people from taking extra trips, make the autonomous car too lovely, and one wants to spend one's whole day sitting in it.
I'm thinking on a systems level.
On a systems
level. I'm thinking, how do we make transit more attractive?
But totally fair point.
Yep.
Yeah. And I agree with you. And we have to have both. You have to have both.
Mm-hmm.
Riccardo, you're in the smart terrain. Tell us where data comes into all of this.
Right. So we live in a super interesting time where, we are kind of on the edge of a technological awakening where all of a sudden we can merge physical and digital, and part of this integration comes from data. The ability to integrate data in space, the ability to collect data from everywhere and have access to this data live, anytime, anywhere. That is kind of the fuel that makes technology smart to a certain degree. So I think that before we're talking about software, hardware, and spaces, everything is becoming one. It's becoming an experience. So from a user perspective, from a person perspective, I move around a space and I want to have an experience, whether that is through hardware, software, or some kind of other smartness that happen, some kind of invisible technology. It kind of doesn't matter, right? I just want to have a better life, I guess. Is that what we want? Like, ultimately, what do we want, right? Do we want to achieve more? That's what Microsoft's statement, for example, is. Do we want to be able to do more with our life? Do we want to visit more places? What do we want? Because ultimately, if every solution that we introduce also some problems. Every time that we go out and solve an existing problem out there, the solutions that we introduce also carry some problems with them. For example, you go from walking to a horse to a car to a self-driving car. Every time there is a new technology, first of all, it takes us a little bit of time to adopt this new technology. And secondly, there are some side effects that we couldn't foresee fully, and then we try to fix and innovate. So something that I find always interesting is to think about what is the most fundamental problem that we can solve. What is the most fundamental problem that we can go out and solve so that we don't end up solving what is just a side effect of a technology that we introduce early.
So what is the most fundamental problem?
So that's a good question. If you look at humanity, it looks like we had a hierarchy, the Maslow hierarchy of needs. That's one. We have some fundamental desires that it looks like we all go after, such as teletransport is one, omniscience or immortality, and others. So in this case, the question is, what do we want people? What do we want? Is it about being able to visit most places, and therefore we should optimize for that? Is it about we could make it so that everybody can, in any instant, jump on a car and go from A to B, right? There are going to be some consequences. There's going to be traffic. There's going to be other problems. Maybe it used to be pollution. There's going to be something else in the future. I think that asking a little bit ourselves if there are smarter ways to solve problems that are not necessarily the most obvious in front of us is going to be important. The fake Henry Ford quote about if I ask people what they want, they would have said faster horses. It might apply also to this moment in time. It might be that actually what is going to be the next thing is not a one-step evolution from what we see today. It might be that we'll make cars as we know them today, but they can drive themselves. And then later on, maybe we'll understand that there is something more that can be done, or something that is not just a one-dimensional innovation, but is a multi-dimensional innovation. I think that another aspect I find extremely interesting right now is thinking about self-driving car is what is going to be our relationship with technology moving forward. Meaning that until, from early days, we use technology as, simple, predictable tools that require human interaction. We are now at a stage where we use computer and other technologies that we work with, we interact together. With self-driving car, all of a sudden, humans are not required, potentially. And so thinking about what do we want to do with our time becomes an interesting question. In the moment that you have solved most of our problems, what do we do? Is it about entertainment? Or is still there is some kind of the experience of driving itself is going to be something that certain people will want to maintain? If I think about manual shift or automatic shift, manual shift is either for a very cheap car or for an expensive car. Because some people want to keep the experience of the manual driving. So I'm kind of interested to see how also that will evolve when it comes to self-driving car. Will some people want to maintain some of the thrill and the experience of being in control? And how is that going to be the relationship with technology? Who is going to drive, and how is that handover going to work?
I think that's a huge issue right now. I mean, for every person you meet that says the autonomous car is going to make our cities so safe, there's so many advantages, the other person says, hang on a sec, I'm never going to give up control of my car, and I hope it never happens. So there's a very big schism in terms of attitudes towards the autonomous car. Where do you think we are in relation to its survival? I mean, we're hearing we're getting this sense that we're really on the brink, but are we?
On the brink of?
On the brink of
Full autonomy?
Yes.
It does. I mean, I don't think we are.
So-
Do you think we are?
We're working on it.
That wasn't the question, Mike.
Because you said 2025. I heard you say BMW 2025.
Full autonomy from BMW by 2021.
2021. 3 years. So what do you have to
The
do,
magic
Seleta?
number.
So at the city, what are you doing to prepare for this?
Well, I think that one thing that's important to put a fine point on is that in the United States last year, we had the highest number of traffic fatalities in the last 50 years. And Los Angeles is no different. We had a 50% increase in the number of fatal crashes involving 2 drivers. So we're not even talking about people walking, people biking. We're talking about drivers, right? And so crashes and fatals always increase whenever gas gets cheap or whenever the economy is good. But this kind of leap that we saw is explained by something more than that, which is that when you've got so much tech in your car that distracted driving is a given, and we know that most crashes happen when the driver takes his or her attention off the road for more than 3 seconds, then it starts to paint a picture of a very rocky transition to full autonomy. Because there's going to be this moment where there's all this tech in the car, but the human in the loop has not given up control, and the fleet of vehicles out there is not fully autonomous. So you could also see this tipping point, and I think Mike talked about a little bit at the beginning, this sort of transitional period that's going to happen. It's not going to happen overnight because there's going to be 12 OEM softwares out there still solving for my Aunt Clarine in her red Cadillac from 2005 that she is not giving up for you or anybody. And that transition is, there's a lot of interesting things. Now you go and you take your car to be smogged if you live in California, and you have to go have it checked, and it has to meet certain requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So you could imagine a future where we get to a certain tipping point where all of a sudden everybody is required to go get their car connected, right? So even if your car was not built with autonomous features, you still have to take it somewhere so that it can communicate with other vehicles, right? And those kinds of things, those kinds of questions, and when that transition is going to happen, and when we're going to demand that it happen because of the safety issues that we're seeing because of the tech in the car, is, I think, an interesting, maybe a more interesting question than when will we have level 5 autonomy, right? It's more about, well, what is the arc of that transition? And to Riccardo's point, I think really understanding what we want is critical. This dream of being able to go from downtown to get ice cream in Venice in 20 minutes, is that really what we want? Is that really what we're after? Is that the problem we're trying to solve for? Will that make us happy? Because you'd get a very different set of design features and rule making and regulations and technology if you were trying to solve for that problem than if you were trying to solve for how can I make my neighborhood a walkable, vibrant space.
Mm-hmm. And that's where design becomes more of a process than an output, right? Where we think about design thinking and how we start with understanding really the context and the user and delivering to their real needs rather than sort of going off to a secret lab, tinkering around and sort of putting stuff out based on just a bunch of transportation designers.
Although you do have a secret lab. I bet Riccardo has a secret lab too. I don't have a secret lab.
Riccardo, you wanted to say something.
So yeah, I was thinking about what you were saying about the transition and what are going to be the steps that it will take us as a society to understand how to relate with the autonomous vehicles. And something I find very fascinating is this. There are a number of buzzwords, including that now everybody uses without necessarily giving depth to the words, including machine learning and artificial intelligence. So if you think about these vehicles to be intelligent, it means that we are delegating certain tasks, and we are okay with vehicles to interact among us. Okay? So we trust technology so much that it's okay, and we believe that we trust technology up to the point where we believe it will not harm us, or it will take care of us or the people we care about. Now, something that is going to be interesting is that there is no such a thing as not smart, and that's it. There is a gradient, right? And there is a gradient also among the people, so much that we behave and we treat a child or a doctor in different ways. We have different expectations. So much that in society we call someone doctor or engineer, just to help us understand how smart and what expertise that person has. Similarly, that might happen with vehicles. It might be that I see a certain vehicle and I'm like, the vehicle cannot be trusted, I need to be safer. And instead, there might be another vehicle that is very, very smart, and I will trust it fully. Now, that adds a lot of complexity. So I'm super interested to see how are we going to relate with autonomous vehicle, and how are we going to understand, how are we going to set our expectations? I can make an example. Let's say that if now we use a personal assistant, piece of software, an AI, people tend to interact with the personal assistant asking only certain questions, because people learn that they can trust the personal assistant around certain topics. Similarly, I will probably not talk to you in Italian because I don't have the expectation that you speak Italian. Maybe you do, I just don't know. Most importantly, my expectation is that you will not learn Italian from one day to the other, right? So let's say I'm interacting with a piece of technology, an assistant. I ask a question, the assistant doesn't know the answer. In my mind, I've recorded that that assistant doesn't know about the specific topic. If this assistant tomorrow learns Japanese, it will be a surprise for me. Similarly, with cars and anything that is going to be around us, is going to be very challenging from a design perspective and super fascinating as a challenge to define how to set people's expectation of how smart a system is at any given time. So that means that there is going to be, for example, I'm crossing the street. And now I built some level of expectation of depending on how a driver approached the stop, whether the driver will stop or not. I will understand if it's dangerous or not. When it's a self-driving car, when is the moment, how much will you trust it? They're not going to be perfect straight away. So how are we going to communicate to people how smart different systems are, and how to maintain that trust is going to be extremely interesting.
Well, there's going to be the smartness, the degrees of smartness that you've just said, but there's also the capacity for them to play together in the sandbox. Seleta just referred to the fact that the city doesn't get Uber and Lyft's data because they don't share it. Right now, when we use Waze or Google to map, we can't get information for where there's a left turn with a traffic light, because as I understand it, again, the data doesn't get exchanged. So when you've got these blockages in the sharing of very important fundamental data, can we trust that the systems are going to connect? And who has jurisdiction over that? Is that you? Is that the cities, or is it the car companies?
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Because it's nobody, and so then that means it gets concentrated in these weird ways, and the data that comes to us ends up being very lumpy, and it makes informed decision making very challenging at the local level, and trying to figure out the streets and the routes that need to be designed different ways, and where could we actually open it up and make it a park in the middle of the day, and where is that not going to work. As we sort of increasingly don't have access to the data and can't understand what's going on our streets, there are real consequences there. So I think it is, we're moving towards clarifying those kinds of things and trying to create platforms where anonymized data can come in, because it's hard to do good design in the absence of good data.
Because that really does seem to be the macro systems design challenge. But you're saying it's unclear who it falls to. And do folks like yourselves get together to constructively debate these kind of macro systems design challenges?
It's something that's really encouraging about living in Los Angeles right now. The mayor's office and the DOT, I think, are doing a terrific job of reaching out and engaging in a lot of different kinds of public-private partnerships, and instigating a lot of these really great questions, so we can all kind of come together and arrive at a collaborative solution to the bigger problems.
Yeah, more than we did, but not as much as we should. That.
Well, with that, we should conclude. We have a couple of seconds till our time is up. I want to thank our panel so much: Mike Milley, Seleta Reynolds, Riccardo Giraldi. Thank you all for attending.